Welcome back to Tongue of the Serpent. If you're continuing, thank you for returning. If you're just arriving, I do recommend beginning with the first chapter as this story unfolds piece by piece, each episode opening the door a little wider. In the first two stories, we met Lucien Devereux as the keeper of the crew of the Morning Star, a man who handles grief, bargains, and consequences with unnerving calm. We also saw that his life reaches further into the dark than a little shop on a New Orleans street should allow. Now the danger moves out into the open, not into a hidden room or a private ritual, but into the heart of the city, where a voice begins to gather listeners and language itself starts to feel unsafe. This is the Seven-Tongued Saint. The Square of Voices. Jackson Square on Sunday morning belongs to the preachers. They arrive early, staking their corners like territorial birds, black shirts and bright ties and sun-warped hats. Some hold battered Bibles with pages soft as handkerchiefs. Some shout through cheap megaphones that crackle like frying oil. Some sing, because singing sounds kinder than warning. Some condemn, because condemnation is tidy. Most are ignored, because New Orleans is polite about other people's fervor, the way it is polite about other people's pets. You nod, you smile, you keep your hands to yourself. Tourists drift past in loose flocks, smelling of sunscreen and powdered sugar, taking pictures of the cathedral, the fortune tellers, the iron lace balconies. They treat the square as a postcard you can step into. They do not always notice that postcards can bite. Local musicians tune instruments under the cathedral arches, brass and string, and that familiar patience of people who have played the same corner 1,000 times and still manage to make it feel like a first kiss. Palm readers set up folding chairs, smoothing velvet cloths that remember 1,000 nervous hands. Painters arrange canvases along the fence, bright voodoo queens and glowing jazz musicians, and storm-lit streets that look like they were painted from a dream the city had about itself. The air carries heat, brass music, spilled beer that never quite dries, fried dough, incense, and a dozen variations of salvation. New Orleans is accustomed to spectacle. The city has a tolerance for holy noise. It has listened to sermons delivered from stepladders and street corners for 300 years and has learned to take what it wants from them. A good line, a little drama, an excuse to pause in the shade. But sometimes something unexpected arrives, something unusual, almost inexplicable. One August morning, a tall man in black stepped into the square as though he had always been meant to stand there. He was rail thin, dressed for mourning in a city that sweats through its sins, his hair neat, his shoes too clean for the streets. He brought no sign, no bucket for donations, no smiles for the tourists. He simply opened his mouth and began to preach. At first, no one paid attention. Then people stopped, and then they listened, because the language he spoke was one no one had ever heard, and yet it sounded like something they had always been missing. The language with no roots. By the next week, the man had a name, Not his given name, of course, but a designation because New Orleans refuses to hand out real names to strangers. It gives nicknames the way it gives drinks, quickly, generously, and with the faint hope it will make the night more interesting. They called him the Seven-Tongued Saint. He didn't have 7 tongues in his mouth, lolling about like serpents at a carnival show, but people swore that every time he spoke, the voice changed. Sometimes it sounded young, bright as a bell, sometimes ancient, as if the words had been dragged up from a riverbed and were still dripping. Sometimes masculine, low and measured. Sometimes like something hollow, echoing inside a well, the kind of voice you hear in your own skull when you are almost asleep and you do not remember what your name is. His words were unrecognizable. They weren't Latin, though they had the cadence of ritual. They weren't French, though they slid across the air with a kind of elegance. They weren't Creole or Spanish or any dialect common to Louisiana. They didn't sound like anything that belonged to this city, or any city, but they felt like language. They carried rhythm, cadence, structure. They made the body lean forward the way a body leans toward a story it expects to understand. People began recording him on their phones. Videos spread quietly through local networks, passed from bartender to tattoo artist to grad student, shared with captions that tried very hard to sound casual. At first the comments were jokes, street preacher speaking nonsense, performance art, somebody's MFA project gone feral. Then the tone shifted, the way weather shifts when a storm decides to take your afternoon personally. People began describing strange experiences, dreams that tasted like blood remembered rather than blood itself, voices that arrived in the shower, in the space between songs on the radio, in the pause before a friend answered a text, words repeating in their sleep. A bar patron swore the bartender had begun chanting in the middle of a shift, hands still wiping down the bar, eyes unfocused, mouth shaping syllables like prayer. A tourist said the preacher's words followed her back to the hotel room, curling under the door like cigarette smoke. Someone wrote online that they woke with black ink on the pillowcase, dried in the shape of letters they could not read, but could not forget. And still the preacher returned every morning. Still he spoke, and the crowd grew, not in the way crowds grow for anything fun, but in the way mold grows, in the way a rumor grows, in the way a song grows when too many people hum it without realizing they have started. Dr. Alice Renault. Dr. Alice Renault did not believe in miracles. She believed in phonetics, in historical linguistics and morphology and language evolution, in the slow, rational drift of human sound into meaning. She believed in the long patience of scholarship, the way a single mark on a clay tablet could keep a person company for a decade. Alice was raised in a household that valued scholarship above sentiment. Her Vietnamese mother taught classical piano with the stern tenderness of a woman who had seen talent wasted and refused to allow it under her roof. Her French father taught literature, the old kind, the kind that assumed you could argue with the dead and sometimes win. Their dinner conversations revolved around ideas, not superstitions. Questions were encouraged. Answers had to be earned. Mystery was not romantic in that house. Mystery was a puzzle that implied you hadn't done enough work yet. Alice learned early that feelings were allowed, but facts were preferred. She worked at Tulane University, specializing in languages that had died. Old Sumerian, where the gods were bureaucrats and the prayers sounded like contracts. Etruscan fragments, stubborn and half-missing, like a story told by someone who keeps stepping out of the room. Indus script speculation, the long, elegant silence of symbols that refuse to confess their meaning. She studied languages that existed only in broken clay tablets and partial inscriptions, languages you had to coax back into being with patience and a little humility. Her entire discipline rested on one central truth. All languages come from somewhere. Even the strangest linguistic system can eventually be traced through roots, migrations, shared sound shifts. Language grows like a tree. Branches, leaves. A visible lineage, even when the trunk is hidden. That was the comfort of it. There was always an origin. When Alice listened to the recordings of the seven-tongued saint, she became deeply uncomfortable because she couldn't place its roots, its linguistic ancestry, its sound families. This was a language unrelated to anything familiar or comparable. It seemed unrelated to anything human. Even the phonemes shifted between recordings, as though the language was changing itself in real time, adapting to the listener, learning the shape of the ear that received it, which was simply impossible. Alice listened to the audio again and again. Each time she heard something new. Each time she felt slightly more uneasy, like a careful scholar realizing her subject was steadying her back. Eventually, she reached the conclusion all rational people reach when confronted with something irrational. She needed to hear it in person. Jackson Square again. Jackson Square was humid and crowded when Alice arrived, the kind of humid that made the air feel like a held breath, the sort of heat that pressed shirts to backs and turned every movement into a negotiation. Street performers competed with brass bands, each convinced they are the rightful soundtrack of the morning. A trumpet skated up a scale. A snare drum rattled like dice in a cup. Someone nearby was selling iced coffee out of a cooler with the solemnity of a priest administering communion. Artists hung paintings along the iron fences, clipping canvases to the metal like bright flags. Fortune tellers fanned their tarot decks with the slow confidence of women who know the future will arrive, whether anyone likes it or not. Alice slipped through the crowd with the quiet focus of someone who has already forgotten she is part of it. The preacher stood near the cathedral, in the narrow wedge of shade cast by the building's pale stone. The sun slid across his shoulders like something trying to decide whether to stay. His audience formed a loose circle. Some watched with fascination, heads tilted, smiling as though they had stumbled upon a particularly convincing piece of street theater. Some looked half-dazed, eyes unfocused, mouths parted slightly as if waiting for rain. A few stood perfectly still, lips moving faintly, repeating syllables that have no business belonging to them. Alice stopped at the edge of the crowd. She took out her phone and pressed record. Her other hand opened the small notebook she carried everywhere, the pages already crowded with phonetic symbols that looked like a family of insects arguing. The preacher's voice rolled across the square. Without shouting or straining, it carried clear as the cathedral bell at high noon. Alice began writing, approaching the language like a puzzle. She broke the sounds apart, finding repeating units, She identified the grammatical structure, her pencil moving quickly, translating sound into symbols, symbols into possible roots. But the language refused to settle. The syllables rearranged themselves. Patterns appeared, then dissolved. A phrase that sounded stable suddenly twisted halfway through, the vowel lengthening into something that didn't exist in any human phonetic chart. Alice frowned and rewrote the line, once, twice. It was like trying to write down a dream while still inside it. Her head began to ache, a steady, rising pressure, like someone gently pressing their thumbs against the inside of her skull. Her ears rang with a high, patient tone. Her vision blurred slightly around the edges. The square softened into watercolor. Still, she wrote as the preacher continued to speak. Then he looked directly at her, and their eyes met. The effect was immediate and precise, like a lock sliding into place. The smile spread slowly across his face. Warm, conspiratorial, pleased. Again, the language shifted. Alice heard the change before she could understand it. The rhythm tightened as the syllables aligned. For a single flicker of time, she understood the language and the meaning behind it. A thought pushed gently into her mind, as clear as spoken English. You should not be listening. Alice stumbled backward, her notebook slipping from her fingers and striking the brick with a sound that felt too loud for the moment. No one reacted or seemed to notice. The crowd remained entranced by the words. A woman beside her nodded slowly, eyes closed, repeating a phrase that sounded like wind passing through teeth. The preacher continued speaking as though nothing had happened, his gaze moving away from Alice, already focusing on another listener. Alice retrieved her notebook with hands that felt slightly disconnected from the rest of her. She turned and walked quickly away from the square without looking back. The words followed her, twisting, shifting, patient as rain. The first rule. That night Alice dreamed. The dream arrived without introduction, the way storms arrive in Louisiana, already halfway through the sky by the time anyone notices. She stood in a city that was not a city, a place of building which possessed no sky. Above her hung a vast weight of darkness, something heavy and patient, pressing downward as though gravity itself had become interested in the architecture. The buildings were wrong, with towers made of bone, and the way forests were wood, structural, inevitable, rising in pale columns that curved toward the invisible ceiling. The streets beneath her feet were paved with moving letters, symbols sliding beneath her steps like living insects, rearranging themselves in long, patient migrations. Voices whispered everywhere, in the thousands, in the millions, layered and overlapping, all speaking the preacher's language. The sound should be overwhelming, but instead it felt intimate, close, as though every voice was speaking directly into the back of her mind. Alice walked without knowing why. Somehow she knew the direction, the way a river knows the slope of the land. The voices continued. She understood none of it, even as she understood all of it. Meaning arrived without translation, emotion without grammar. The language was unspoken. Instead, it was remembered. Something moved ahead of her, a shape rising from the shifting streets, tall, impossible, a silhouette that seemed to exist in several places at once. Something with no clear face, but it possessed mouths, 7 of them, The mouths moved in the place where a face should be, where a throat might be, where shoulders and shadow meet. Each mouth spoke a different sentence. Each voice used a different rhythm. Alice tried to focus, to listen, but her mind fractured in the attempt to separate the sounds. The sentences wove together like threads pulled too tight. The strange figure leaned toward her, and the voices aligned. One sentence emerged from the chaos, unspoken. Instead, it announced itself directly inside her, with the same meaning she heard in the square, but deeper now, curious, interested. You are listening. Alice opened her mouth, intending to deny the obvious truth, wanting to wake, but instead words spilled out, syllables that tasted like wet stone and something faintly blood-warm. The language answered itself through her, and the 7 mouths smiled. The dream collapsed as Alice woke with a violent gasp in her dark bedroom. Overhead, the ceiling fan spun erratically, even while her throat burned. She pressed a hand to her mouth. Something thick and bitter coated her tongue. When she pulled her hand away, the faint smear on her fingertips was dark, black with ink. The shop that appears when needed. The next morning, Alice walked through the French Quarter without direction. She told herself she was clearing her head, that the dream was stress or academic obsession from too many hours listening to recordings. Her mind supplied explanations with admirable efficiency, even as her feet ignored them. She turned corners without deciding to turn. She passed cafes where people sipped coffee with the comfortable seriousness of people who have chosen pleasure as their morning ritual. She walked past balconies dripping with ferns and old stone. A fortune-teller arguing cheerfully with the man who insisted the cards must have misheard him. Eventually, she stopped walking, almost unconsciously, only vaguely cognizant that she had arrived somewhere. The shop stood between a tailor and a closed bookstore. Alice felt certain it was not there yesterday. The sign above the door read, "Crew of the Morning Star." The lettering was old-fashioned, without trying to be charming about it. The shop itself looked old, lived in, weathered, ancient in the way a tree looks aged, as though it had been standing in this exact place long enough that the street simply learned to arrange itself around it. The windows held strange artifacts, masks, jewelry, odd instruments with strings that looked like they might remember music long after the musician had gone home. None of the objects felt decorative. They felt patient, like survivors. Alice pushed the door open, and a small bell rang overhead. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old paper, tobacco, and something darker that might have once been incense. Inside the shop stood a man with ginger hair and luxurious beard that looked like it had opinions about grooming. His tailoring was immaculate, Victorian, dark waistcoat, crisp shirt, and a pocket watch chain catching the low light. Lucien Devereux looked as though time politely stopped arguing with him several centuries ago and decided to mind its own business. He was pouring tea, 2 counters already set waiting on a table near the front counter. He appeared unsurprised by her arrival. Instead, he glanced up with mild interest, like a man whose guest has arrived precisely when expected. "Dr. Renault," he said, voice warm, cultured, even slightly amused. Lucien set the teapot down and gestured to the waiting chair. "Do come in," he said gently. "I've been expecting you." Lucien and Alice. Alice remained standing. She studied Lucien the way a scholar studies an inscription that might either reveal a lost empire or waste 6 months of her life. Lucien waited calmly. Patience suited him, resting on his shoulders the way dust rests on old books, comfortably, permanently. The tea steamed between them. Finally, Alice sat, and Lucien poured a cup for her. The cups were delicate porcelain, thin enough that light passed faintly through the glaze. The tea smelled faintly of bergamot and something darker that might have once grown in a forest no one remembers. Lucien offered her the cup with the careful courtesy of a man who has practiced manners for several centuries and has no intention of abandoning them now. "Well then," he said pleasantly, "what seems to be troubling you this morning, Doctor?" Alice did not bother with pleasantries. "There's a preacher in Jackson Square." Lucien tilted his head thoughtfully. "Ah, which one?" Alice stared at him nonplussed. "The one speaking in a language no one recognizes." Lucien nodded slowly. "Yes, that does narrow it down somewhat," he observed mildly. Alice did not smile. "He's drawing crowds," she continued. "People are dreaming about it. Some are repeating the words in their sleep." Lucien sipped his tea. "And you'd like my opinion?" "I'd like an explanation." Lucien studied her over the rim of the cup, his eyes bright with the kind of amusement that suggested explanations are a currency he spent carefully. "The trouble with explanations," he said, setting the cup down, "is that they encourage people to keep asking questions." Alice leaned forward, working to remain calm, polite. "That's how knowledge works." Lucien raised a ginger brow. "Yes, I've noticed." He stood and walked across the floor, going behind the shop counter. He reached under it and withdrew a book. His movements were leisurely, unhurried. The book itself was not large, but it carried a certain gravity, the way some objects seem heavier than their size should allow. Its cover was cracked leather, dark with age. Bands of metal ran across the binding, a color too dark to be silver and too quiet to be iron. The surface had the dull sheen of something that had spent centuries resisting definition. Symbols were engraved across the front. They shifted slightly when the light moved. Alice's eyes locked onto them immediately, and her fingers twitched. She rose and crossed to the counter. Lucien placed the book on the counter between them. He did not open it. Alice reached for it, but Lucien stopped her with one finger. The gesture was light, effortless, but final. "You don't want to do that," he said gently. Alice's hand hovered in the air above the book. "I absolutely do." Lucien sighed softly, as though disappointed by the persistence of human curiosity. "Languages," he said, "are rather like doors." Alice frowned impatiently, gaze fixating on the book. "Most languages open doors between people," Lucien continued. "You say a word. Someone understands it. A small bridge appears between two minds." He tapped the cover of the book. "Some languages open doors between worlds." Alice slowly lowered her hand, her eyes moving to his face. Lucien's voice remained calm. "And some languages," he added quietly, "are not meant to be spoken by human mouths." The candlelight near the counter flickered slightly, as though it had decided to pay attention. Alice made a conscious effort to keep her hands still at her sides. Lucien continued. "If you study the language your preacher is using," he said, "you may eventually learn to speak it properly." Alice lifted her chin. "That's the goal." Lucien nodded yes. He folded his hands neatly atop the book. The difficulty, he said, is that once you can speak it properly, you become audible. Alice regarded him with mild puzzlement. To whom? Lucien's smile returned, patient and thin. To things, he said, that normally cannot hear humanity at all. The silence that followed was brief but sincere. Alice looked at the book again. This time she did not try to touch it. Lucien slid it gently back beneath the counter. I'm afraid I won't be selling that today, he said. Alice exhaled slowly. Why not? Lucien's eyes rested on her with quiet interest, because once someone learns that language, he explained gently, patiently, the language begins to learn them back. Across the street, Alice noticed the woman halfway through Lucien's explanation. At first, it was only a flicker of movement in the window behind him, but then the shape resolved. Across the street, beneath the soft glow of a cloudy New Orleans sky, stood a woman. She was tall. Her posture carried the easy authority of someone who was accustomed to being noticed. Her hair was honey blonde, piled high on her head in an elegant knot that suggested patience rather than vanity. She wore a long velvet gown the color of dark wine, seemingly unaffected by the August humidity. The hem brushed the pavement with a soft whisper, the fabric moving like something that remembers colder centuries. She stayed across the street, unmoving, simply watching the shop. Her expression was one of mild amusement, the kind a theater-goer wears when the play has reached a particularly predictable moment. Alice glanced at Lucien. He had followed her gaze, a faint crease appearing between his brows, appearing unsurprised and unconcerned. "Friend of yours?" Alice asked. Lucien considered the woman for a moment. Something like that. Across the street, the woman lifted her eyes slightly. For a brief instant, Alice felt the weight of her gaze, cool and assessing, like a historian deciding whether a document was worth preserving. Then the woman smiled, small, patient, with evident satisfaction. Lucien sighed softly. Honestly, he muttered, does she have nothing better to do? Alice raised an eyebrow. Should I be concerned? Lucien shrugged lightly. Concern is rarely productive. Outside, the woman turned. Her movements were graceful and deliberate, the velvet gown catching the gaslight like dark water. Rain began to fall, gently, a thin silver curtain sliding between the buildings. By the time Alice looked back toward the street, the woman was gone. Lucien crossed back to the table, resuming his seat as he returned his attention to the teacups. As I was saying, he continued calmly, languages can be doors. The language spreads. Alice returned to normal life. For 3 days, she managed it reasonably well. She taught her classes, responded to emails, graded papers written by students who believed language exists primarily to avoid saying anything clearly, but the preacher's language had already taken root. It appeared first in small places. One of her students muttered an unfamiliar syllable while searching for a word during a lecture. A street musician outside the campus cafe played a strange progression of notes that resembled the cadence of the preacher's speech. A colleague mentioned having a dream about a city with no sky and immediately laughed it off as a result of grading too many midterms. Alice heard fragments everywhere, clinging to her, echoing in the way a melody sometimes survives in your head long after the song has stopped. The videos from Jackson Square continued spreading, and the crowds grew larger. Then, one morning, A second preacher appeared. He stood on the opposite side of the square. His speech lacked fluidity, the words stumbling out of him in fragments, like someone trying to remember a song they once knew as a child, but the language itself was unmistakable. Lucien heard about it that afternoon. Alice found herself back in the shop, standing in front of the counter again. Lucien listened quietly while she explained. When she finished, he nodded once. "Of course," he said. Alice folded her arms. "That's it?" Lucien reached for the teapot. "Language," he said thoughtfully, "has a curious property." He poured tea into 2 cups with steady hands. "It spreads." Alice sighed. "I'm aware of how communication works." Lucien shook his head gently. "No, not like that." He set 1 cup before her. "This particular language spreads the way a melody spreads." Alice frowned impatiently. Lucien continued with an almost indulgent smile. "You hear it once," he said, "and it lingers in the mind. Someone hums it absent-mindedly. Another person hears the humming and begins humming as well." His voice lowered slightly. "Soon half the room knows the tune." Alice considered this. "And the preacher?" Lucien's gaze drifted toward the shop window. "He isn't humming," Lucien said quietly. He tapped 1 finger against the table. "He's singing." Alice waited for more. Lucien's expression became thoughtful. "Anyone who hears enough of the language may begin repeating pieces of it," he said, "but only a few people ever become mouths." The word hung between them. Alice shuddered uneasily. "The original preacher," Lucien continued, "is one of them, a host, a conduit." He lifted his teacup again. "A door," he said calmly, "a voluntary one." The choir. After moving to the table and seating himself, Lucien expounded on things at a leisure pace. Explanation, in his opinion, should be treated like good brandy. Slow, measured, preferably accompanied by the faint possibility that you might regret finishing the glass. Alice waited while he poured another cup of tea, working to contain her impatience. Finally, she said, "You mentioned something called the choir." Lucien nodded. "Yes, that's not reassuring." "It isn't meant to be." He settled more comfortably at the table across from her, folding his hands. "They are not gods," he said, "not demons either." Alice opened her notebook again, pencil poised. Lucien watched this with quiet amusement. "They are older than either classification," he continued, "older than most of the words we use to pretend we understand the universe. Ancient scholars had many names for them: the choir, the speakers, the forgotten," Lucien explained. "They were merely attempts to describe the sensation of encountering them. They do not invade worlds through armies. They arrive through syntax." Alice paused. "Syntax." "Yes," Lucien tapped the table thoughtfully. "Language is the operating system of reality. Most people never notice because the system runs quietly in the background. Words describe the world, and the world behaves itself accordingly." Alice studied him carefully, interest deepening. "You're suggesting language shapes reality." "I'm suggesting it does considerably more than that." Lucien smiled lightly. "The choir cannot enter directly. There are boundaries, ancient ones, stubborn ones. Reality, like a well-built house, does not appreciate strangers wandering through the halls. But language can erode those walls, slowly, patiently, through meaning, repetition, and the gentle insistence of an idea spoken often enough." Alice wrote frantically in her notebook. "If enough humans begin speaking their language," Lucien said softly, "the structure of reality begins to loosen." Alice felt a small, cold weight settle behind her ribs, and eventually Lucien finished. Someone opens the door wide enough. The plan. Alice stared at him. So stop the preacher. Lucien shakes his head. No. Why not? Lucien leaned back slightly. Because the preacher is not the problem. He gestured toward the window where the rain continued to slide down the glass. He is merely a conduit, a host, a willing mouth. Destroying him would accomplish very little. Alice stopped writing. She placed her pen down carefully by her notebook. The language has already escaped into the world, Lucien explained with an easy shrug. It hums in the back of people's thoughts now. It lingers in dreams. Once a melody has been heard, it becomes very difficult to convince the mind not to hum it. Alice rubbed her temples. So what do you do? Lucien reached into his waistcoat pocket and withdrew something small. A coin-sized disc of dark metal. Time had worn its surface smooth, except for a faint spiral etched into the center. The spiral seemed almost unfinished, as though it had been interrupted mid-gesture. This, Lucien said, placing it gently on the counter, is from the last time someone tried to sing their way into this world. Alice studied it. It doesn't look like much. Lucien smiled faintly. It isn't. He tapped the metal disc lightly, but it contains something rather rare. What? A silence. Alice frowned. Long ago, certain scholars discovered that if language can open doors, it can also close them. Lucien explained, not with louder or stronger language, but with its absence. The disc contains a counter pattern, a place where language simply stops. If placed at the correct point in the square, it will briefly collapse the resonance the choir is using to echo through human minds. Alice folded her hands in her lap and regarded him with the patience of an impatient student. It will interrupt the song, Lucien continued with an almost amused smile. The choir will lose their grip on the preacher, and the door will close for a while. Alice unfolded her hands and stretched them, watching him with a frown. That doesn't sound permanent. Lucien's smile deepened. Nothing ever is. The confrontation. Jackson Square at dusk is a different creature entirely. The crowds have thinned. The cathedral looms pale against the darkening sky. Street lamps burn softly along the edges of the square, their light reflecting off rain-slick brick. Lucien and Alice crossed the empty stretch together. The space felt used by something older than prayer, as though the language had been spoken here so often that the stones were beginning to remember their part in it. The preacher stood near the center of the square, waiting. His black clothes hung loose in the damp air, his hands folded calmly in front of him. When Lucien and Alice approached, he smiled, with something eerie and unearthly behind it. Ah, the voice said, emerging from the preacher's mouth, but the sound was layered now. Several voices spoke through the same throat. You again. Lucien sighed softly, almost apologetically. Yes, he said, I do tend to show up at inconvenient moments. The preacher's head tilted. You have closed our doors before. I have. You are tiresome. Lucien shrugged politely. I've been called worse. The voices rippled faintly through the preacher's body, as though several minds are attempting to speak at once. Alice felt something tighten behind her forehead as the language hummed beneath the darkness, waiting. Lucien stepped forward, holding the metal token between two fingers. The choir noticed. Their voices sharpened. You would unmake the song. Lucien did not answer. He simply dropped the token onto the wet brick. The effect was immediate. Reality stuttered. Just a small, precise hesitation, like a record needle slipping off the groove. The pressure in Alice's mind vanished as the language collapsed around the square, like broken music. The layered voices unraveled. One by one, they withdrew from the preacher's throat. The heaviness in the air lightened. The silence that followed felt almost enormous. The preacher swayed slightly. Then he straightened, looking confused, merely human, and very tired. "What?" he began. Lucien gently raised a hand. "It's all right," he said. The man stared for a moment. Then he turned slowly and walked away into the night, no longer carrying the choir, just a man again. The consequence. Alice exhaled slowly. "Is it over?" Lucien watched the dark corner where the preacher disappeared. "For now." Alice folded her arms. "That's not comforting. It isn't meant to be." They walked back toward the edge of the square. The night air felt strangely clean, as though a storm had just passed. Alice hesitated. "In my dream," she said quietly, "I spoke the language." Lucien glanced at her. "Yes." "You knew?" "Yes." Alice stopped walking. "What does that mean?" Lucien considered his answer carefully. "The choir," he said, "does not forget those who answer them." A slow unease crept into her chest. "You replied in the dream," he continued. "You became audible." Alice looked toward the dark cathedral towers. "So, they know me." Lucien nodded. "They do." "And now?" Lucien's voice remained calm. "Now, you live. That's your advice. It's the best available." Alice let out a short breath, steadying him. "And when they come back?" Lucien's eyes reflected the distant lamplight. His answer was quiet. "Hope someone else is listening more carefully." Morning returned to Jackson Square, as it always does. Tourists arrived with cameras. Street musicians began tuning their instruments beneath the cathedral arches. Artists clipped fresh paintings to the iron fence. Palm readers smoothed velvet cloths across small folding tables. The city resumed its comfortable performance. The preacher did not return, so the crowds drifted elsewhere. Life continued, but somewhere at the edge of the square, a young street musician began humming softly while polishing his trumpet. It was not a song he remembered learning, just a melody that arrived quietly in his head, a strange one, unfamiliar but pleasing. He hummed it again, and somewhere, far beyond the skyless city of bone towers and shifting letters, the choir listened. So now you have seen another side of Lucien Devereux. He is not just the man who receives the desperate at his counter. He is not just the man who survives old bargains with his posture intact. He is the man people find when the world itself begins to come slightly unstitched. In The Seven-Tongued Saint, the threat was not grief exactly, or temptation in its usual velvet clothes. It was language, meaning, a pattern that could slip into human mouths and begin loosening reality from the inside. And Lucien, with his tea, his books, his patience, and his impossible little silences, proved that what he keeps at the crew is more than curiosities. He keeps thresholds. He keeps, when he can, the world from opening its mouth too wide. But stories like this never end as neatly as people want them to. The preacher was quieted. The door was forced shut for now, and yet the choir does not forget those who answer. Dr. Alice Renault heard them. She answered them. She became audible to something beyond the edges of ordinary speech. And somewhere, even after the square returned to normal, The song lingered in another human throat. That is often how danger works in this city. It does not leave. It echoes.